Heavenly Creator, bless us with a faith that is humble enough to realize that we can never fully know you, yet is strong enough to trust that we don't need to fully understand your mystery in order to believe. Amen.
Amen.
Good morning, friends. Good morning. As Father Jonathan mentioned, my name is Shelley. I'm a lay preacher here at St. Paul's. I preach about once a month, so good morning and welcome. Today's gospel story is one you probably immediately recognized as the Doubting Thomas story. It's so famous that Doubting Thomas is a phrase that you hear in secular pop culture to describe a skeptic who won't believe something until they have physical proof. Now, you might think this is a pretty black and white story. Thomas doubted, Jesus showed him physical proof, Thomas believed, and Jesus calls on us to believe even though we don't have physical proof. End of story, wrapped up nice and neat. Today, I'd like to take you on a deeper exploration of this story, one that touches on the nature of faith itself. Perhaps you're familiar with this Bible verse about faith from the book of Hebrews. This is verse 1 from chapter 11. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. As humans with our own subjective realities, it's natural for us to accept things as true only once they become true for us. Theologians call this subjective appropriation. That's when we believe something because we've come to know it as personally true for us. That's what we're seeing here with Thomas. Jesus had risen even before Thomas believed in it. But for Thomas, the resurrection only became real once he had incontrovertible physical proof for himself. An objective reality became a subjective truth. How many times in our own lives have we too denied and doubted things that are objectively true just because we don't understand them, or because we can't see them for ourselves, or because we're afraid to admit their reality, or because we fail to grasp their overwhelming enormity? Here's a simple example. If it's rainy and cloudy outside, that doesn't mean that the sun has ceased to exist. You just can't see it at that moment. No one would argue that the sun only exists when you can see it shining. Here's an even more fascinating example in keeping with our sky analogy. The planet Neptune was only officially discovered in the year 1846. But no one would argue that Neptune only started to exist at the time that astronomers confirmed its existence. In fact, as far back as 1612, Galileo Galilei spotted Neptune with his telescope when he was looking at Jupiter. But he thought it was a fixed star, not a planet. And then in 1821, an astronomer saw that Uranus had a strange wobble in its orbit. And that made this astronomer think maybe there was something out there that was having an effect on Uranus, even though he couldn't see it. In 1846, two theoretical mathematicians did some complicated math to try to determine where exactly this other thing might be located in the sky. Then they tried to convince state-funded observatories where the most powerful telescopes were located at that time, to point at the spot that they had calculated. But neither the Paris Observatory in France nor the Royal Astronomer in England took them seriously. So they sent their math to the Berlin Observatory, which had just published brand new star charts. And the star that these mathematicians were positing was not on those charts. An astronomer at the Berlin Observatory decided to check out the coordinates. And sure enough, there was Neptune, right where it had always been for eons. Now, this might seem like a complicated analogy, but really it's not. This is a story much like Thomas. It's a story of faith that turns to belief once there is physical proof. In today's gospel, Thomas is saying, the resurrection is only real if I determine that it's real with physical proof. But the fact of the matter remains. Jesus had risen even before Thomas touched him. Neptune existed even before astronomers confirmed it through their calculations and telescope. So let's bring it back down to earth, pun completely intended. What Jesus is encouraging us to do in today's gospel is to cultivate a faith that does not require physical proof in order for it to be real. And in fact, I would venture to guess that you yourself have had at least a few personal examples of the reality of God, even though you don't have physical proof. Those examples, those personal experiences of God that can't be proven, but you know are true, those contribute to your faith. You don't have to prove it to others in order for it to be real. St. Augustine, who lived between the 4th and 5th centuries, famously said, "Si comprehendis, non est Deus," which means, if you understand it, it is not God. Faith isn't based on physical evidence or proof. Faith is an experiential knowing that God exists, even if our 5 physical senses can't directly perceive God in the way that we're used to perceiving the rest of our physical world. Faith is an exploration in which we begin to perceive the reality of God as we walk the path towards God through prayer, through worship in community, and through service to the world around us. It's a bit like the story of the 6 blind men and the elephant, which tells what happens when a group of blind men encounter an elephant for the first time. One of the earliest versions of this parable is a Buddhist version that goes back to 500 BC. You can imagine it as any group of people gathered in a dark room. The first person touches the elephant's trunk. It's a snake. The second person touches the tusk. It's a sharp spear. The third person touches the ear. It's a large fan. The fourth person touches the leg. It's a tree trunk. The fifth person touches the side. It's a sturdy wall. The sixth person touches the tail. It's a rope. When it comes to the incomprehensible mystery of Jesus' resurrection, we're not given to understand this event on a rational or physical level. Even if we could touch Jesus' side, like Thomas did, it still wouldn't fully explain the infinite mystery of the resurrection. This is why, if we want to authentically encounter Jesus, we must adopt a new approach. We need to see with the eyes of our heart. We need to go beyond our five senses and trust the divine spark inside each of us, the part of us that can sense God in those still and quiet spaces, in those places of knowing without having physical proof, but knowing nonetheless. The world will always challenge this, but we must be humble enough to realize that we are part of God's story, part of God's mystery. And just because we don't see it with our physical eyes doesn't mean it doesn't exist. May we cultivate a faith that dares to trust in what we can't see, a faith that leads with the heart and senses with the soul, so that we may continually grow in our knowledge of God. Amen.